Wonderful. Hi there.
So he can see you now.
Okay. Hi, Charlie. It's Scooter.
Hi, Scooter.
It's been a couple of
How you
days.
doing?
If it's okay with you, I'm going to introduce you to this wonderful group, and then we will have people asking you questions.
As long as you don't embarrass me.
Oh dear. Well, I better sit down then because okay. Actually, okay. So I'm going to disappear for a second and walk over here to the microphone, introduce you, and then I will be turning things over to Leslie. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Charles T. Tart, the father of parapsychology. Actually, all these years, I've called him the grandfather. What? Is this better? Okay. All right. So I have a few things I'd like to say about his accomplishments because they are numerous. You can't pop in now. You've got to let me finish, Charlie.
This is the part where I always don't know what to do. You know? Who's this person they're talking about? You know. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. They're not looking at you. They're looking at me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you could pipe in if I say anything that's not accurate. So, Charlie has been a professor for a number of years. 28 of those were at UC Davis. He's also been a faculty member at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. He's a research fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, professor emeritus now at Davis, and he is the first holder of the Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies at the University of Nevada. He's also served as the visiting professor in East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and as an instructor in psychiatry at the School of Medicine at UVA, our own very place here, which I think had something to do with him and Bob, but we'll get to that later. Charlie has written 14 books. I think he's working on at least 3 others right now. Knowing Charlie, it's not just one more. And more than 250 articles that he's written or contributed to. But beyond all this wonderful academic stuff, he is also a professor of Japanese martial arts. That's not what I meant to say. He's a martial artist in Aikido. It's not, is that better now? Okay, is that good? All right, okay. He's got a black belt, probably at least one. He has been a studier of Gurdjieff's work, Buddhism, and other psychological and spiritual growth disciplines. And I assume this is still the case because it's been the case as long as I've known him, which is a number of years. His primary goal is to build bridges between the scientific and spiritual communities to help bring about a refinement and integration of the Western and Eastern approaches for knowing the world and for personal and social growth. So you can see why he and Bob may have kind of meshed a tad bit, all right? One of my favorite memories of Charlie was when we were at Whistlefield Labs and I was walking down to the house from the lab and there's this huge oak tree in the front yard and I looked up and there was something moving way up in it and I looked and it was Charlie. He had climbed the tree, and so for me, Charlie has always been a youthful, I mean, he doesn't age for me. You look the same pretty much too, Charlie. So he has a youthful spirit, he's a brilliant man, and quite frankly, I'd say without him, we would not be here now. And the reason why is, of course, how he helped Bob first get his book to the publishers, to Doubleday, which I'll let him tell his own story there. But what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Les. You're going to start the questioning, is that right? Okay, Les is going to give you the 3rd degree, Charlie, and bless you for being here. Thank you very much.
Let's give the 3rd degree. Who are all these folks who all seem to be looking off over to the right? Out experience because I'm actually off to the left or right somewhere,
No,
even though I'm here.
You are off. You're off to our left as you're being mirrored on the big screen in the middle of the back of the room. So they're actually looking at a large image of you. But you're talking to the 26th gathering of the professional seminar. Bob founded the professional division in 1982, and the first seminar was in 1983. There hasn't been one every single year, but this is the 26th.
All right.
And as you know, it's a momentous year for us because of Bob's centennial, and also today, the 17th of March, is the 20th anniversary of Bob's death.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I know, it's hard to believe. And in that regard, we are focusing on the legacy of Robert A. Monroe as our theme. And you are certainly a major part of that. So thanks again for being here with us and being willing to share some stories. We really, really appreciate it.
Okay. Go ahead, Leslie. Where should we start?
Okay, I would love to get the ball rolling. To find out from your point of view, we all know from reading Bob's books his side of the story about having met you. I mean, he didn't write a lot about that, except that you were his, psychologist friend, and you worked together, and you were instrumental in helping him move through the process that he was finding himself involved with, and that he trusted you enough to give you his journal of these activities that he was experiencing, and that you said, after having read it, oh my gosh, you need to publish this, after which he kind of spaced that out, and sometime later, Doubleday called saying, we want to publish your book. And he said, what book? And therein hangs a tale. So we would love to hear your side of that story.
Well, I love to hear the way the myth is evolving. Most of that wasn't true.
Okay.
Okay, so given that I'm still alive and I was there, let me tell you what I think happened. I first heard of Bob in the summer of 1957 when I was working with Andrea Puharich at his laboratory up in Maine. And he told me about this fella he knew who had out-of-the-body experiences. And I may have read some manuscript of Puharich's then or something like that, but I sort of vaguely knew there was somebody in Virginia who had out-of-the-body experiences. That was the end of that for several years. I had to finish up college, go to graduate school and all that, and after 2 years of a postdoctoral fellowship in California, I was offered a research position at UVA with Ian Stevenson, the guy who did all the reincarnation research. So I thought, oh yeah, didn't Puharich tell me about this fellow Bob Monroe that I really ought to try to meet if I ever live in Virginia? So I looked Bob up and we hit it off very nicely. Now, when I first mentioned it to him, I think that Puharich had told me to get in contact with him. His reaction was funny. I sort of assumed that they knew each other well and were friends. But as he later told me, there had come a point where he was very ill a number of years before this, and his first wife, whose name is slipping my mind, Mary? I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, he was married to Mary. Yes.
Thought he was dying and took his notes about his out-of-the-body experiences and sent them to Puharich without ever asking Bob whether she should do this. Okay?
Oh my
Bob
gosh.
did die and eventually got really pissed off about this. Bob was particularly angry, more than I thought was necessary, but the way Puharich wrote about this a little bit, he called Bob Ramey or something like that, gave him a pseudonym. That was fine. But he mentioned that one of Bob's out-of-the-body experiences came when he had been fixing some shelves in a closet and the glue fumes got to him. And then he laid down and had an out-of-the-body experience. So somehow it sounded in the book like there was this glue-sniffing addict somewhere who was having weird experiences. And this was not the way Bob thought of himself, you know. He didn't like drugs of any sort. This was an accident that had happened once. He'd already been having out-of-the-body experiences and whatnot. I assume they eventually worked that out. I don't know. Anyway, when I got to Virginia, Bob and I got to know each other well, and he had already written up his first book and sent it to his New York agent. And a year had gone by, and the agent had not contacted him once about any publisher whatsoever interested in publishing Bob's book. And I thought that's ridiculous. I mean, I'd read the manuscript of Bob's book and said, hey, this is wonderful stuff. I said, okay, I know an editor at Doubleday who's doing the paperback version of my Altered States of Consciousness book. Let me talk to him. I talked to him, got Bob to send him the manuscript. Then things got very interesting. My editor friend took the manuscript home to read it after dinner. He was just going to glance at it. You know, editors get so many manuscripts, it drives them nuts. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he was still reading. And he came to the chapter on how to do it. And he closed the book because he was afraid if he read how to do it, it might happen. He wasn't at all sure he was quite ready for that at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's the story of how Bob's book got published.
Oh, wow.
Loved the book. He offered Bob a contract and so forth, and that's how it got published. And I don't know, Bob used to tell me once in a while, you know, that it still sells a lot of copies every year. To call it a classic in the field is to put it mildly, but that's how the book got started. So I did a little midwifing there, but not quite as dramatically as you described at the beginning. But who knows, maybe the myth will grow.
Well, I was going to say,
I
this
was
is a
sitting in my
myth-buster right
laboratory
off the
one
top
day, and
here.
this manuscript materialized out of thin air, and then
Wow, thank you. That is very interesting. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to somebody you know pretty well who has the next question.
Hello,
good
Charlie.
morning, Joe, or good afternoon for you, I guess.
I'm not going to say anything that will embarrass you, but you can send me the check later.
Actually,
I have a simple
I have a
question.
question for you, but I'll let you do your thing first.
Okay. Did Bob know that he would actually be outed with the publications of Journeys Out of the Body? I know what
Yes.
it means to a career and all the subsequent changes. Do you think he was prepared for all of that?
He considered, and we talked about whether he should publish this under a pseudonym. And, you know, I don't recall the details of our conversations at this point, but he decided he should do it straight. And he probably expected, you know, that a few dozen people in California or something might read a weird book like this, and nobody else was going to read it. You know, especially in Charlottesville, nobody would read about weird stuff like that. But as you know, it got a little bit more exciting.
It got legs,
Now-
as they say.
Now, my question for you, Joe, somebody has been telling me I should write an autobiography. And I've resisted the suggestion for years because I don't think I've led a very interesting life. You know, I haven't robbed any banks, toppled any governments, slept with any movie stars, you know, just do stuff in the lab, no big deal. But somebody's persuaded me that I could use this as a vehicle to teach some things. And I realized, oh yeah, not that many people like to read straight scientific writing, but everybody loves stories. If I could make stories that would convey some interesting things. So one of my stories is something you may be able to shed a little light on because of your time in the Army.
Okay.
I gave a lecture once in Sacramento that included talking about my research on out-of-the-body experiences at that time. And a few minutes after I started lecturing, couple of guys walked into the room carrying a big box, sat down in the back row, and there was something about their bearing that said these people are from the Army and they don't give a damn about what I have to say, but they open the box and start their tape recorder. And I thought, should I be flattered that my government is spying on me? Or they could have just written for reprints and found that stuff straight. And I'm very curious because I think this was overlapping sometime around the Army starting the remote viewing program and all that. And would you happen to know, was somebody really checking?
Can you remember the exact year or time of month of the year?
I can't remember it, but I can look it up pretty well.
Yeah, if it was in the very early 70s, yes, I know why. It was early research for the Army program.
Ah,
So it would have been the 1973 to 1975 period, I would suspect. It could have also not been the Army. It could have been Army recruits of the CIA, because the CIA was involved from 72 to 75.
I don't know, something just, these guys were, something just said Army, but I can't tell,
Yeah. When the CIA does their field work, they never use their own agents. They're too valuable. They spend millions training them, so they go out and hire Army guys to do it because we're expendable.
Okay.
That's a myth being busted here too.
These two guys were not at all interested. They could barely stay awake through the rest of my talk, which I found a little exciting. I think I talk reasonably well, but
Yeah, they were
interesting.
only
I'll
interested.
look up the date and let you know about it.
Okay, send me an email. And I think you should write that autobiography, by the way.
Thank you. All right, where shall we go next?
Thank you, Charlie.
Incidentally, it's interesting to me to see this room because I used to come back and visit Bob every once in a while, and sometimes one of the courses would be running and he'd be talking to a bunch of people in the evenings down there. And I found it really fascinating how straight Bob was, okay? Because a lot of times the people who would come to the programs, they wanted to make him into a mystical guru with strange powers and all that. And Bob wouldn't let him do that. Bob would give him straight answers. He said, well, A, B, and C happened to me. I don't know anything about D, E, and F. And I really admired him for it because it was a lot of pressure to go in that kind of direction from people. And it's a psychologically dangerous direction to go. And Bob stayed really honest and centered. Anyway.
Yes, and not only dangerous to him, but it would have completely changed how the work of the Institute has been able to perpetuate itself.
Oh, yeah.
Walking that razor's edge of science and consciousness. So
I haven't been back to the Institute in a long time, but I assume there's no shrine room with a picture of Bob with incense burned in front of it all the time.
Well, there is, but it's locked. Charlie, I have a question from one of our members, Suzanne Morris, which is, you and Bob and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross collaborated on the Going Home series several years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And she wants to know, how did the series begin and how did it evolve through your collaboration?
We spent a lot of time talking on the phone about that, sending materials back and forth. I'm trying to remember what originally gave Bob the idea. Probably somebody close to him who was hospitalized and dying, and he saw an opportunity there to be able to help people. But I can't recall the specific incident. Maybe it was when his mother was dying, but I don't remember the timing on that. But the main thing, I don't know what Elizabeth did with him, okay? But the main thing I did with him was look at his scripts and what's the word I want? Make them less authoritarian, okay? Bob had a style which was kind of an old-fashioned hypnosis style of you will relax. You will relax now. which when it works, and it works with some percentage of the people, is great. But when it doesn't work, it immediately builds up resistance. I said, I'm relaxed. I don't feel relaxed, you know. And I persuaded Bob to change the wording to, it's like, you could relax more now, you know, so people could have a partial response, which would build some confidence and so forth, rather than you do it, and if you don't do it, I guess you failed kind of thing. So that got a lot incorporated into the scripts, and then I don't really know what happened with the program after that. I had hoped that I would get reports once in a while, you know, that it's been tried on X hundred people now with such and such kind of results, but I don't know what's happened. I hope wonderful things have happened, but I don't know. Because it was a beautiful idea.
Well, wonderful things have happened with the series. It's been extremely comforting for many, so thank you for your part in it. I have another member here, Rosanna Schaffer-Shaw, with a question for you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm in great awe of actually being able to speak to such a giant in the field of parapsychology. I have to say that to begin with. But my question is, what do you think is the most persuasive, the most compelling piece of solid evidence that human consciousness is not exclusively a physical brain phenomena, that consciousness is more than that?
I want to thank you for asking a simple question, but that's a smart-ass kind of response. So let's go at it more seriously, because that's a really important question. I'm not a single crucial evidence kind of guy. Okay, it's a complicated world, and things go together. So, for instance, in the book I wrote a few years ago, The End of Materialism, I made two big divisions to begin with. The first was what I called the Big Five, which are 5 psychic phenomena, which I think there's so much evidence for, you know, telepathy, clairvoyance, things like that, that anybody who says, oh, I don't believe in that stuff, they're ignorant. They're ignorant or prejudiced, because, you know, there's so much evidence, much more than for many other things that we accept. Those Big Five provide a kind of general basis to say, if you say our mind is nothing but our brain, you're ignoring all sorts of facts that don't fit. So there's an opening to a non-physical, a larger component. Then I go into the stuff that I call the many maybes, which includes stuff like out-of-the-body experiences, survival of death, reincarnation, stuff like that. And I call them the many maybes because they're things for which there's a lot of good evidence. There's a lot of maybe so, maybe no kind of stuff. And it's sort of reasonable even for people who know the stuff to say maybe there is reincarnation, maybe there's not. You could interpret it another way. Overall, to me, I'm convinced that we survive death and that we have a soul or something that's more than our physical body. But I don't know that that's true. I mean, in the sense that, you know, there's a kind of psychological state which is very comforting when you're in it, where you totally believe something. And then people who don't believe it are a real pain in the butt. I try on the one hand to take my scientific training seriously and say I want to look at the evidence for something and say, you know, there's a lot of evidence for this. So I could say, to be cautious, my working hypothesis is that I'm more than just my body. I'm likely to survive death and the like. I don't know it in any absolute sense. And if evidence comes in that pushes in the other direction, I'll have to pay attention to it. And then there's my own spiritual kind of intuitions and hopes and aspirations where, it makes sense to me to assume that it's not just this life, we're going to go on. So, for instance, I'm starting to have a problem with anger. Okay, and I remember when I was a kid, I had problems with anger, and my mother was always telling me you should control your anger, because I would flare up and whatnot. And I noticed it's starting to come out again. Well, if I was a strict materialist and figure, heck, I'm 77, I'm probably not going to be around here much longer. What can I do to enjoy myself? The anger's not that big a deal. That's what I'd do. Or, get somebody to give me a drug to suppress the anger or something like that. But if I think, as I do, as is my working belief, that I'm going to go on for something more, then I better do something about that anger starting to come up again, because it could cause me trouble for a long, long time. Makes me a long-term planner rather than, the quarterly gains in my stock or something like that. So did I answer, or did I totally avoid the question?
I thank you for your answer, and I think it was an excellent answer. I think that you did answer the question, but it may not have been the answer that I suspected, or it didn't give me something exactly that I could say to critics or people who might be. I wanted one compelling statement to say, listen here, now you don't believe this, but Charles Tart, Professor
I'll
Emeritus, says this.
Hold on a second. Okay, compelling evidence. Gee, this reads backward in my monitor. Does it read forward in yours?
Forwards to me.
Okay. This is a summary of my whole scientific approach to this, with my spiritual influences in there also. Only 3 years old. It's not a survey of all the research that's ever been done, but it's about those big five, the many maybes, and the reasonable conclusions to draw from it. And here's the important reason I wrote this particular book. I've met so many people who have had a spiritual experience of some sort, or very much would like to have a spiritual experience or to develop earlier ones, and they think, no, science has proven that's all nonsense. Okay, this is a book to say that is not the case. Of course there's lots of nonsense. There's nonsense in every area of life. But science has not proven that there's no soul or anything like that. If you look at the actual evidence, then it's reasonable to be both scientific and spiritual in your orientation to life. That's a reasonable way to live. And that's my message to people.
Well, that's very good, because I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to read the book. I've looked at it. I'm going to read it again from cover to cover, and I'm going to...
Great. Yeah. There's the details, okay? There are not too many copies of it left. Amazon still has them, but they're not doing a paperback. And I don't know, there's less than a few dozen of the hardback copies left. I'm trying to look for a publisher for a paperback edition, but I haven't gotten around to it really yet. But that's my detailed answer in the book.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Oh, and to add a personal note to that, after I die, I'm really kind of hoping Bob will show up and say, well, it's about time you got here. Let me show you this stuff.
That sounds exactly like something he would say. Well, Charley, we just had an equipment failure. The projector has overheated and it's not displaying you in large format. So now we're all staring at the computer screen. So you may see a change in orientation.
You're looking at me. That's interesting.
I have, I'd like to return to the personal. And by the way, thank you for that. It was a fascinating response to Rosanna's question. What?
Can I elaborate on that response,
Oh,
actually?
absolutely, please.
It's very interesting. When I was still a teenager, I read about parapsychology and psychic research and stuff and got really interested in it. And that included reading what evidence there was even back at that time for survival after death. And I was intellectually convinced, yeah, we probably survive. But you know, I'm not even 20 yet. It's not really all that interesting. I'll probably get more interested in this as I get older. Sure enough, my prediction was correct. And so for the last, almost 20 years now, I've been running an internet discussion group of the few people who are actually accomplished researchers and scholars when it comes to the evidence for survival. And that's been very interesting to keep these people talking to one another. And one way I've summed up my convictions about this, because we have to get into all my research on altered states of consciousness now, I think that when I die, there'll probably be a period of unconsciousness. There'll probably be some suffering ahead of time too, but I hope that gets by quick. There'll probably be some unconsciousness, and then I won't be surprised if I regain consciousness. But I'm going to be surprised if I regain consciousness. Because all my psychological work and whatnot has made me realize a lot of who I think I am is at least partially shaped by the way this physical body operates. And if I don't have this physical body there to keep patterning the way my mind functions, it's probably going to start to get different. And that's going to be really interesting. For better or worse.
One of the things that we've been looking at here at this seminar and this year is what is Bob's legacy anyway? And, you know, again, not to create, sort of a mystical figure out of him, but, you know, he left behind something that is continuing forward, and we don't really see an end to it. And everybody has their personal experience of what that may be for them, as well as how it may propagate in the world. Can you sort of, do you have a Charles Tart definition of Bob's legacy and what that looks like?
Well, let me think about that. I haven't thought about it in those terms before. I mean, clearly Bob has a legacy. You guys are it. And the many people who've gone through the programs, the books that have spread all over. When I got interested in out-of-the-body experiences, again, back when I was a teenager, I was reading weird books, but they were really esoteric, weird sorts of books. And probably hardly anybody in the world would have heard of a word like astral projection or out-of-the-body experiences or something like that. Now you can talk about it with an awful lot of people, especially since near-death experiences came out of the closet, right? That's a method I don't recommend for having an out-of-the-body experience because it's too tricky, but so Bob's techniques are much gentler and more recommended that way. So the idea that people could learn some skills and try it for themselves and begin exploring on their own is a fantastic idea. Especially I grew up at a time when anti-establishment sentiments were pretty strong, don't bow down to authority and all that. You want to become spiritual, you don't have to believe Swami, Maha, Guru, whatchamacallit. You can explore, you can find out things for yourself. But Bob really encouraged that kind of thing, To my knowledge, unless something's changed a lot, Bob didn't lay down a doctrine of, it's exactly like this and you must believe it or else. Bob gave people tools for exploring. Now, that's dangerous if you want everybody to go in the same direction, because they may use the tools differently and go in different directions. But I think it's wonderful if, as you realize, as Bob realized, he didn't have all the truth. He had some very interesting looks at things from his own experiences. He'd love to share it with people. One of the main topics of our conversations over the years, especially the early conversations, was he was lonely. How could he train other people to begin to have out-of-the-body experiences themselves so he could talk with other people who'd been around there, instead of he's just a weirdo and can only kind of talk to himself. So it's wonderful that he started the Institute, that it's still going after all these years and whatnot. Where it will go eventually, I don't know, but I think you all know it's gone to some very interesting places already.
Yes.
You know, you guys actually know the answer to that better than me.
Yep. Thank you, Charles. Okay. I got Frank DeMarco here with a question for you.
Hi, Charlie. You
Hi.
don't know me, but Bob Friedman and I published one of your books, Body, Mind, Spirit, a long time ago, Hampton Roads.
Yeah.
It's a sort of an off-the-wall question, but in Bob's first book, as I reread it too late to ask Bob because he was already gone. But in his very first series of the vibrations, where he was exploring these things, he said that it began on that Sunday afternoon lying on the couch, and there was a light that came out of the north from the sky, and he never talked about it anymore, and he never made any sense of it that I know. But I wonder if he ever mentioned it to you, or if he talked more about it. It seemed so strange, and there was no follow-up to it.
Well, we talked of many things that never actually made it into the books. I'm not terribly good at remembering what they were. At least that one, that doesn't ring any bells with me.
Okay. It was in the book, but there was no, as I say, no follow-up. I just thought I would check.
Yeah.
Thank you for everything you did for Bob. It was huge.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Charlie, it's Ann Nunley.
Yes.
Hi. I have a question for you. In an exam that I was sitting, the question was asked to the poor student to please give a relationship between self-actualization, self-realization, and enlightenment. And then I heard you give a talk, yeah, I heard you give a talk in which you talked about the relationship between enlightenment and endarkenment. Would you just give us a little clip on that, please?
Ah, yes. Well, I am a world expert on endarkenment. I've been practicing studying it for more than half a century now. Okay, so I'm really not sure what enlightenment is, but when I do stuff that doesn't contribute to my endarkenment, I figure I'm moving in the right direction. Your question is very important, okay?
Okay.
The model of enlightenment that people have had most of the last half century, for those who have that model at all, of course, is that there is some single final ultimate state a human being can evolve to, and like a mountaintop, and there are different paths up the mountain, different spiritual kinds of systems. That might be true. On the other hand, sometimes I think maybe there's a number of different mountaintops, and every one of them is a fantastic accomplishment to get up to the top of it. And on each one of them, you then run the danger that you're going to think that, oh, those other mountains are all much smaller than mine, and it doesn't really matter. So, enlightenment. One of the strangest experiences of my life was at a conference in, I believe it was Amherst, Massachusetts, some years ago. It was one of the first conferences His Holiness the Dalai Lama had with Western psychologists and scientists. And somehow I was asked to give a talk on altered states of consciousness and enlightenment. And my turn came to talk, and the Dalai Lama usually wasn't there. He had affairs of state to attend to, and he was there for my talk. And I got up in front of the microphone, and I thought, who the hell do I think I am? I'm talking about enlightenment in front of the Dalai Lama? When is he going to start throwing tomatoes? It was very, it's like I split into several people at once, okay? One of them was I became a 14-year-old kid from New Jersey again, for whom something like the Dalai Lama in Tibet was total myth, and he was back there. I could hear the translator translating stuff for him. Oh my God. And another part of me was trying to be a competent lecturer and give a good talk because I thought I had something to contribute. And the third part was just so incredibly embarrassed. How in the world had I ever had the chutzpah to do this? Well, I don't remember what I said, okay? I'm sure I have my notes on it somewhere. But interestingly enough, a few hours later, a guy in a suit came up to me and introduced himself as the head of security for the college that the conference was being held at. And he wanted to thank me for my talk because he said he'd been around all weekend checking security and all that, listening to people. I was the only one all weekend who said anything he could understand. But I think what I try to do is be very careful about talking about things I don't think I really understand, even though it's very tempting. Okay, Leslie mentioned, or Scooter mentioned, I forget which, that I have a black belt in Aikido. Of course, I started out as somebody who wouldn't know a martial art from a hole in the ground. And we had a black belt instructor come up to UC Davis where I was teaching then, and I went to every class and whatnot. And I soon found that in about 3 weeks, I could explain the martial art of Aikido much better than my black belt instructor. I could relate it to physics and philosophy and different aspects of psychology and whatnot. I mean, he hadn't finished high school and I was a professor. I mean, in retrospect, I think I had a black belt in talking by about the time I was 12 years old. For all my talking, I couldn't do anything. I could hardly sit up straight compared to my instructor. It took me about 3 years to begin to understand that there was a knowledge here, but it wasn't a verbal knowledge. And in fact, verbal stuff got in my way a good deal of time. It took me 3 years to listen and look in a different way and actually begin to know some of that. That was my first big lesson in different kinds of knowledge. So that's why I've been beating around the bush with respect to this question of enlightenment, self-actualization, and so forth. I know I'm a good talker. I can convince myself sometimes that I know something when I don't really know it. So I'm being very cautious with you. So let me start from endarkenment, because it really is a serious question, okay? Endarkenment, we all understand the idea of neurosis, okay? We ordinary people are allowed to walk around loose because we don't step in front of cars in the street and we treat each other reasonably politely and whatnot. We know the basic rules. And a neurotic is somebody who's got some emotional distortion of the way they see the world. You know, all those people are looking at me funny. They don't love me. No, they're not even paying any attention to you, but you know. So we understand neurosis, and from the perspective of some of the spiritual traditions, we're all extremely neurotic. Compared to what our ultimate spiritual nature is, we have a very narrowed, very distorted idea of what it could be. And one consequence of that is we do stupid things, we create suffering that's not necessary, and so forth. So one of the themes I understand is Gurdjieff's way of putting it most is to become more awake, to not walk around in a kind of neurotic daydream, filtering everything in the world, but have a clearer perception of what's actually out there in the world in front of you at any given moment, what you're actually doing, you know. So if you've learned to pay closer attention to your own bodily reactions, for instance, you might know that sometimes somebody said something to you which intellectually is very interesting, and some part of your body is freezing up in some weird way. That's a good hint that there's some emotional distortion going on. You learn to sense things like that. 50 years ago, when the same year I was living there in Virginia, actually, I read about this kind of thing in P.D. Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, and he talked about how you do it. You kind of split your perceptions. So in addition to taking in the outside world, you're kind of watching your own reactions at the same time. And at some moment, I did it, and I woke up. And for a few seconds, it's like I'd never been awake before in my life. I was alive. Everything before that had been some robot kind of running through things. After about 3 or 4 seconds, I went back to my ordinary state, and I was able to talk about that experience, but not have it again. It took years and years of training before I could come more to the present. So in retrospect, I call that a relative awakening. But if that could happen, maybe when spiritual traditions talk about some kind of much bigger awakening, self-actualization, enlightenment, something like that, the possibility strikes me as being there. Now, how much of it is actual accomplishment and how much of it is just feeling good? I don't know. You know, I can look back, for instance, and say, I felt like I was more awake and alive than ever, but was I really? You know, maybe I got a shot of endorphins, to use the current excuse for feeling happy or something like that. So I'm still beating around the bush, and because I know I could go on and get into much more detail on this, but I think I should leave room for other things. So excuse my beating around the bush, but hopefully it lifts the endarkenment slightly.
We feel that it was very enlightening. Thanks, Charlie.
Jim is up next. He's our research director right now.
Good.
Hi. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to you. You won't remember, I'm sure, but we met in the mid-'70s when the Parapsychological Association convention was at UC Santa Barbara. And I came there by myself, did not know anyone, and it was you and your grad students at the time who took me under your wing, let me sit with you at all the meals, engaged me in conversation, and that had a tremendous impact. I was just starting grad school at the time. And in all the years since, you've continued to be a strong influence on me in all the books that you've written and the emails that you're distributing now. And I just wanted to express my gratitude to you for that. I think
Thank you.
I'm sure I'm not the only one that you've had such an impact on over the years. I was hoping, given the interests of this group, if you could tell us a little bit of the background story for the studies you did on out-of-body experiences in the lab at UVA. I remember reading them a few years after they were published. They had, and I've been telling people about them ever since. The psychophysiological studies, I think Bob Monroe was in one that you published, and there were, I think, was a second one. And, you know, given that everybody here is interested in the out-of-body stuff, what gave you the idea to give it a try that way, and how did those studies come about?
Okay, it's a little confusing because the order in which I published doesn't always reflect the actual order in which they were done and so forth. They came about because, again, my personal story is that I was raised conventionally as a Lutheran, okay? And my grandmother took me to Sunday school and church, and grandmothers, right? The source of all love. One of the most fulfilling things of my life is being a grandparent and spoil my grandkids. And so she took me to church and Sunday school, and if it was good enough for her, it was good enough for me. And so up till the age of 12 or something like that, I just basically believed what they told me to believe. And then I became a nerdish teenager, of course, and noticed how hypocritical adults were, and those people weren't walking their talk and whatnot. And I also began reading science extensively and realized that science and a lot of the stuff that was supposed to be part of religion didn't fit together. And so I started thinking for myself. That led me to read everything I could find on the old psychical research literature, a lot of occult literature. I mean, I think some of the stuff I read must be totally crazy junk, and others of it was good beginnings of science. And that included reading a fascinating book that I was reminded of just before we had this meeting, actually. I have a little picture frame that shows various slides at random, and one of them is slides that influenced me in terms of my scientific thing. And just before this, it had flashed a picture from a book by Sylvan Muldoon and Herwood Carrington called The Projection of the Astral Body. Some of you probably know that book. It's an artist's conception of his astral body floating out of it. And I thought, that's cool. Wow. I'd like to experience that. Never experienced that. But obviously the people who experience it have a tremendous shift in their worldview. Okay, now we jump ahead many, many years. I have a sleep laboratory available. I'm used to studying what happens to people at night. Mainly, I studied people's dreams and whether I could use hypnosis to affect what they dreamed about, which is a whole interesting story in itself. But somewhere in there, my wife come home and I come home after a movie, and we're talking to our babysitter before she leaves. And she mentions that maybe I could help her understand something funny that happened to her. When she was a kid, she used to wake up every once in a while in the middle of the night and find herself floating near the ceiling. You could look down and see her body in bed. And what did that mean, Professor? I thought, that's interesting, because I was under the impression that out-of-the-body experiences were pretty rare. And I think they're still relatively rare spontaneously, and so I told her, well, there's two major kinds of explanations. The one is, it's not what it seems to be. You're hallucinating or having some special kind of dream, something like that. She said it wasn't like her regular dreams. She just felt wide awake and up there. And the other was that in some real sense, she was up there. And she said, oh, how can I tell the difference? And I said, well, there's a little experiment you can try at home. Take 10 slips of paper, shuffle them up upside down so you can't read them, put them on the table beside your bed. After you go to bed, without looking, put one face up on the table. And if you happen to float near the ceiling that night, memorize the number and check it in the morning. We saw her a few weeks later, and she said she tried it 7 or 8 times, and she was always right. Was there anything else interesting we could do? A mean streak in me always says I should switch stories at this point. But anyway, she was leaving the area then, but I managed to have her spend several nights in the laboratory because I thought, wow, I've got somebody who spontaneously has out-of-the-body experiences. She says they still happened once in a while. I knew by that time that they often happen in conjunction with near-death experiences, so maybe there's major physiological changes. I kind of hope not, but... So I was able to study her in my dream laboratory for several nights, and she'd go to bed, and I'd put a 5-digit random number on a shelf near the ceiling that she couldn't see. She couldn't get out of bed because that would pull all the electrodes off and spray ink all over the room from the EEG machine. And again, telling her, if you happen to have an out-of-the-body experience, please memorize the number. Oh, and look at the clock to get the time, too, and wake up and tell me about it. I wasn't asking for much, but what the heck. Well, she had several out-of-the-body experiences where she said she wasn't able to control it enough and make it last long enough to get a look at the number. So she had no idea about the number. But she did show an unusual brainwave pattern during that time, which I had not seen before, in which one of the world's leading experts and I both looked at, and we both had 100% agreement of, that's funny looking. This is how science progresses, right? You expect certain things and something funny looking happens and it gets you curious. The one time she thought she was able to see the number, she correctly told me that the number was, if I remember correctly, 25192 or something like that. Well, that's 100,000 to 1 odds to get a number like that correct by just by guessing. So I was happy, because what I was really trying to do was not make any kind of final proof, but say, is it feasible to take as weird, exotic a thing as out-of-the-body experiences and look at them in a laboratory where you can get a much clearer look at what's going on. I know incidentally, while she showed some brainwave changes, nobody was going to call for the crash cart. This was not medically exciting looking stuff. That was good. You didn't have to almost die to have an out-of-the-body experience. And then she left, and that was the end of that. But, I was happy. I demonstrated the feasibility and then did the same sort of thing with Bob, although Bob wasn't able to read the number because he didn't have quite the right control. So that's how that all got started, a chance remark by our babysitter. Now, maybe up there it was arranged. Maybe it was just chance. I don't know. But it sure made an interesting kind of thing to do.
Thank you. That's a great story, and a lot of it, I agree with that's how things happen in science.
And I naively expected this to create great excitement in the scientific world, and dozens of laboratories try to find people who could have out-of-the-body experiences and check it, but I was still pretty naive about the sheer resistance to accepting this stuff.
Yeah, it did create great excitement for me. So there's one.
Good.
Yes, very much so.
Did we give you good advice back then to be careful who you talk to in graduate school about your interests?
Yeah, actually, if I remember, your advice was to stay the hell out of psychophysiology or out of parapsychology until I had established my career.
Yes, that's my standard advice.
And that's what I've continued to tell others, the students of mine.
Good, yeah. I still get lots of inquiries about that, and I say, if you're independently wealthy, no sweat. But if you have to earn a living, be careful.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie.
Charlie, up next, we have Roberta with a question.
Sounds like a baseball game or something, Who's up at bat?
I'm now up at bat. Hi, Charlie. My name is Roberta Shoemaker Beal, and I think you know my husband, Jim Beal, who's sitting right behind me here. He might wave in a minute. I remember being at a conference maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I think this topic would appeal to the people gathered here, because if I remember correctly, you were collecting the stories of scientists who had some kind of epiphany or expanded awareness that influenced the research that they did. It was a beautiful bridging of science, and I'd love to hear you talk about that and where that research went.
Yeah. Over the years, I've had hundreds and hundreds of people approach me and say, I've never told anybody about this before, and then they tell me some psychic or spiritual experience. And a lot of those people have been scientists, who've added, that if I told this to my colleagues, they'd think I was getting soft in the head or something like that. So years ago, I decided I wanted a better outlet for these people. I'm not available for everybody. So I started a website. If you Google me, you'll go to my main website, and there'll be a link to the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences website.
Yes.
TASTE, the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences, which I worked at for a while, and then I'm interested in too many things. But there's about 70 or 80 experiences there by working scientists. A few of them are doctors who wondered if they were really considered scientists, but sure, why not? And these people had by and large amazing psychic and spiritual kinds of experiences. Again, that they'd never talked to anybody about, especially colleagues. I offered them anonymity if they wanted it. I would know who they were, but, would give them a fake name or something on there. About half of them chose to use their real names, although interestingly enough, they were almost all people who were already retired. So they didn't have to care about what their colleagues thought about them. There are some fascinating experiences there. The Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences. That's what I did. The experiences didn't necessarily influence their careers. Most scientists are pretty specialized, and it's kind of hard to change direction no matter what happens to you. But it certainly had major influences on most of them. I think of it as my website to disprove the myth that scientists have no soul.
Thank you. Could you perhaps offer one or two of the ones that you felt were most interesting or that stick in your memory specifically?
Well, there's one, it's a long one, so I have to shorten it, but it's especially beautiful. I put it into my End of Materialism book. A man who's a professor of psychology and statistics at a Midwestern university, real hard science kind of stuff. His wife died, and they were both agnostics at best and maybe atheists, But he casually told her once, as she was dying, if you're all right on the other side, let me know. But he didn't expect anything to happen, and she didn't expect anything to happen. So several weeks after she died, he was awakened from sleep one night by a knock at the front door. And he figured, it was some young man coming to date one of his daughters or something like that. And he went to the door and opened it. And there was his wife. And he was blown away, And, but of course he wanted to be polite. So, he couldn't quite say, "You're dead, you don't belong here." So he put in some more polite form in the order of, what are you doing here? How can this happen? And he had a long visit, part of which, only part of which he can remember, because part of it is state-specific knowledge. And this happened again at some later time and the like, and it just totally changed him around, and it blew him away. He was a hard-nosed, psychologists are touchy about being hard-nosed, When I was in graduate school, they used to remind me, it's only been 100 years since they let us out of the philosophy department. If we don't look scientific enough, they might make us go back. So psychologists are especially resistant to psychic and spiritual kind of stuff. But he swung his main interests around. He was close to retirement, too. That would help. The original story is infinitely better than the way I'm able to tell it here. So.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And that website again is?
Just Google Charles Tart. Put quotes around it. Otherwise, that fellow Prince Charles gets all the hits.
Oh, thank you.
That's amazing. The first time I ever Googled myself, there were 4 million hits. And then I noticed that guy, Prince Charles, they were all for him.
Oh.
Well, there'll be a link to this Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experience site right on the first page, I think.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great, Charlie. Thank you very much. Carmen is here with a question, and then Scooter will be back to finish up the session. So just for me personally, thanks again. And here is Carmen.
Thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. I have used your Going Home series very much because I'm a resource in the thanatology program at the University of Puerto Rico. And one of the quotes you had in the series, you said that this series is for everyone because after all, we're all terminal patients. It's a question of time. And I love that.
Yeah. I use the opposite of that sometimes when I'm lecturing on survival, and I say, those of you who aren't planning to die won't find this lecture very interesting. You can go now.
So I was wondering if you could tell us an anecdote that you had with Robert Monroe that you think a story that is very interesting. Like you were saying at the beginning, stories have a lot of meaning to people. Some kind of experience you had with Monroe or with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that you could share with us?
Well, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I never actually met her in person, okay? So while we both gave input to Bob on the Going Home series, she and I didn't work directly together. Here's my most interesting anecdote. And I think I may have a prop available for this. Hold one second. Yes, I do. When I found out that Bob had died, I was very sad because, God, how long had we known each other? And I used to try to visit whenever I came back to the East Coast. I really loved the guy, okay? So I found out, I guess Scooter called it. I forget exactly now. And I was very sad about it, and I was writing some words that could be said at his memorial service and whatnot. And in my office, I happened to have a photo of Bob on the wall. I tend to get so wrapped up in intellectual stuff that I put photos of people that matter to me up on my wall to remind me once in a while that, hey, I live in a world with people. Well, my daughter had known that I was very sad because my friend had died, and she had bought me some kind of helium balloon with a heart on it that was bobbing around the room. And as I was writing, I kept noticing that the helium balloon kept bobbing up and popping against this picture over and over again. Why were the air currents continually bringing it from different parts of the room there? So what did I do? I would say, hi, Bob. I'm sad, but I'm sure you're having a ball, so.
Thank you.
He's a great guy. I mean, I guess some of you probably never met him, but he was something.
Yes, he was. It's Scooter, Charley, and I just can't
Yeah,
thank you
Scooter.
enough. I mainly, I guess.
Do you remember, Scooter, when you totally blew my mind at the Nyingma Institute in
Yes.
Berkeley?
But I was there with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You don't remember that part. You did meet her, but we were supposed to be meditating. And I'm sat down right next to Charley, and I'll let you take it over from here.
And
And I kept smiling at him.
This was a meditation at a Tibetan Buddhist center that they used to have, I think, at 5 o'clock every Sunday. And I went to this one, and there's this woman sitting across the room, I don't know, 15 feet away, something like that. And she kept smiling at me. And, she looked familiar, but, I realized that I have my memories organized in some fashion where people were in places, okay? I was in California, Scooter's on the East Coast. Who was this woman who kept looking at me and smiling at me? Took me a long time before I finally, Scooter. Oh, okay.
What are you doing here?
So anyway.
That's a fun memory. Actually, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and I had met, and we went there together and briefly said hi to you. I felt a little guilty because I think I was interrupting your meditation. But then we went drinking afterwards.
Meditation's never been profound enough that you have to worry about that.
I remember it well. Charley, I have a question for you before we close up. I think it's Stan Groff who talks about spiritual emergence or emergency. And I'm curious if you ascribe to that particular theory, what is the difference between the psychotic break and spiritual emergence? Do you have any thoughts about that?
The first factor is, what's the person's personality beforehand? If somebody is pretty unstable, then almost any kind of strange experience might trigger a neurotic or psychotic reaction, okay? If a person's very stable, they might simply be able to say, weird, forget about it for now. But then that takes you into the second factor, how are they treated afterwards? An ordinary person may be pretty stable, but if they're part of a culture or a family that thinks their experience is crazy, they may really worry about it. Okay? On the other hand, even if they're a little bit unstable, if their experience is accepted and they're helped to work with it, to integrate it into something, it can be a growth experience. One of my students wrote his dissertation on what he called the bright shadow. That's actually a term that Carl Jung came up with, although I don't think it's very widely known. Most people know Jung's idea of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we're kind of ashamed of and we don't want to admit to. And that's the dark shadow, okay? The bright shadow. Some people have really beautiful spiritual kinds of experience, but if their culture doesn't allow for it, they're ashamed of it, they essentially get beaten up on psychologically or institutionalized for it. So these people usually learn to suppress that kind of thing. The Groff's idea that there are people who've had a profound experience, and if it's worked with to integrate it into their everyday living, it could become a growth experience. It's wonderful, right? Now, I don't think we know enough that we can say, oh yeah, we can do that right every time and whatnot, but to even try it is a really wonderful kind of thing. I've done that on a small scale quite accidentally, okay? I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not qualified to do that kind of thing. But there have been innumerable instances where somebody has talked to me about this really weird experience they had, and I'm the first person they've talked to, or they tried talking to other people and told they were possessed by the devil or they were going crazy or something like that. And when I listen to them calmly and tell them that's interesting, and it happens to other people, and it has nothing to do with whether you're crazy or not, and we actually have a name for it. Oh, that's what we call telepathy or something like that. There have been a lot of times when a person has gone away feeling so much better about themselves. An authority figure said, it's all right, and it doesn't mean you're crazy. I just wish, people were educated in general enough that nobody would start to worry they're crazy just because they had a telepathic incident or something like that.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. Charlie, is there anything else that you would like to say to us as a group? Some of these people have been coming here for over 30 years, and
wow.
Because they very much are involved with the work, with this whole idea about looking into consciousness. So do you have anything you'd like to say to us?
Yeah.
Oh,
I want to
okay.
say a big thank you, because you're doing something unique, okay? I mean, it's not as if there's 1,000 well-equipped laboratories exploring all these aspects of consciousness. Even though consciousness is more respectable to look at in scientific circles, it's still in a pretty narrow gauge kind of thing. The fact that you guys are helping to make it possible to look at these explorations of the further reaches of consciousness, that's wonderful. Because that's part of who we are too. That's part of reality. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. And thank you for that. And one last thing, I want to thank you so much for the support and love you gave Bob, because that was tremendously stabilizing and empowering for him. Number two, I'd like to thank your wonderful wife, Judy, for supporting you, because without her, we don't make it by ourselves. So please give our regards and love and thanks to Judy. God bless. Thank you so much, Charlie.
And I suspect we're almost officially done.
Yes.
Leslie has to say it.
No, we are officially done, Charlie. Thank you. I'm going to go turn you off.
Hey, I'm from California. You have to turn me on.
Bye.
Have a good 5 minutes.